A snowstorm sweeps across Washington, D.C. as a routine flight to Florida takes off. Suddenly, the aircraft starts shaking. 24 seconds later, it smashes into a busy motorway bridge and plunges into the icy river below. 78 people are dead, and a desperate rescue effort gets underway. How did a routine flight turn into one of the most horrific disasters in aviation history? Now a team of experts must discover exactly what downed Air Florida Flight 90. The aircraft is sprayed with half the recommended amount of de-icing agent. Further delays allow more snow to gather on the 737. And the use of reverse thrust may have sprayed slush onto the wings and critical thrust sensors. 23 minutes to disaster.
Electrical.
Wheaton and Pettit leave their engine anti-ice system off. As a result, thrust sensors in both engines freeze up, causing them to send misleadingly high readings to the cockpit. 14 minutes to disaster. The pilots notice a thick layer of snow on both wings.
This one's got about a quarter to half an inch of snow on it all the way down.
But contrary to regulations, they don't turn back for more de-icing. 1 minute and 3 seconds to disaster. Pettit is confused by unusual readings on the flight deck.
Oh God, look at that. That doesn't look right, does it?
But his captain does not abort takeoff. 24 seconds to disaster. Flight 90 takes off with dials indicating thrust of 2.04 EPR. But because critical thrust sensors are frozen, the real thrust is only 1.7 EPR. At the same time, ice and snow clinging to the wings disrupt airflow dramatically, reducing lift. This changes the aerodynamics of the 737, causing the nose to pitch up sharply. The resulting drag reduces speed, which in turn reduces lift even further. 8 seconds to disaster. The loss of lift reaches a critical point. At an altitude of just 352 feet, the 46-ton aircraft stalls and falls out of the sky. 4:01 p.m. Flight 90 hits the 14th Street Bridge. The disaster claims 78 lives, including those killed on the bridge.
On January 13, 1982, Air Florida Flight 90, a Boeing 737, was a scheduled passenger flight from Washington National Airport, Washington, D.C. to Fort Lauderdale International Airport, Fort Lauderdale, Florida, with an intermediate stop at the Tampa International Airport, Tampa, Florida. Flight 90 was scheduled to depart Washington National Airport at 14:15. The Boeing 737 had arrived at Gate 12, Washington National Airport, as Flight 95 from Miami, Florida, at 13:29. Snow was falling in the Washington, D.C. in the morning and in various insights when Flight 95 landed and continued to fall throughout the early afternoon. Causes. The National Transportation Safety Board determines that the probable cause of this accident was the flight crew's failure to use engine anti-ice during the ground operation and takeoff. Their decision to take off with snow ice on the airfoil surfaces of the aircraft, and the captain's failure to reject the takeoff during the early stage when his attention was called to anomalous engine instrument readings. Contributing to the accident were the prolonged ground delay between de-icing and the receipt of ATC takeoff clearance, during which the airplane was exposed to continual precipitation. The known inherent pitch-up characteristics of the Boeing 737 aircraft when the leading edge is contaminated with even small amounts of snow or ice, and the limited experience of the flight crew in jet transport winter operations. My personal recommendation. In my perspective, I would recommend that all pilots of different aircrafts have sufficient pilot awareness seminars, including considerations for command decision, resource management, role performance, and assertiveness. Better guidelines and procedures should be put in place when it comes to de-icing procedures and pre-checks before flight. Pilots should also clarify that procedures were followed to ensure the safety of flight. Good afternoon, Mr. Courtney.
Good afternoon.
I'm here to interview you on my case study for Air Florida Flight 90. I'll be asking you 5 questions and ask for your honest response.
Sure.
What would you have done if you were the co-pilot on the aircraft and recognized that there was still a thick layer of snow on the right wing?
I would strongly stress not to take off.
Okay. Why do you think that the pilot in command of the 737 still proceeded to take off after reading the dials for the thrust of the plane?
Could have been a few reasons. This was in the early 80s. The captain probably had a sort of complacency to what the aircraft was telling him. Basically kind of doing the same thing over and over, seeing the same scenarios over and over. He might have gotten a little complacent and still proceeded to take off. Another reason why the captain did not abort might have been, the question was, why did the captain still proceeded with the takeoff?
Yes. Why do you think the pilot?
Even though the co-pilot, the co-pilot pointed out there was some ice on the wing.
Yeah.
The co-pilot, it was kind of a different time back then. Even in the early 80s, the captains kind of had that hierarchy where they just kind of, it was like their last word almost, and the FOs weren't as involved in the decision-making process that they are now. So that could have been a contribute to maybe some type of moral struggle between the captain, or we don't know what kind of relationship the captain had with the first officer, but there could have been some type of social struggle between the two, and he might have felt like, well, I'm gonna go anyway, kind of could have been that. So that's really all I can think of as far as why he proceeded to do this takeoff.
Thank you. What would you do if you were the pilot in command?
If I was the PIC, well, I would not go. I mean, there were so many indications of,
obviously,
I don't know if they knew that they didn't get a full de-ice. If they didn't get the full, I don't know if it was the full mixture that they didn't get of de-ice, or if they just didn't fully de-ice all the critical surfaces. But there were so many things just indicating, hey, don't go. I would not go. We learned from all these accidents, we've learned that winter flying and ice is a dangerous thing to aircraft. So we know. Maybe back in 1982, they weren't as experienced with the severity of icing. So maybe, that goes back to question number 1, why the captain decided to go. But I would not have went knowing what the hazards that the icing conditions can bring now to aircraft. So I would definitely not have went.
All right, perfect. What do you think could have been done to prevent this crash?
Well, it all started on the ground. It was all about decision making. This was pure pilot error. This was not the aircraft. This was not the mechanical error. This was not. This was a failure in a breakdown in communication, a breakdown of procedures, of whatever procedures they had back then. It was just a total breakdown. The captain should not have went. They did not have the anti-ice on. They did not, as I understand, they didn't have any anti-ice running, or at least for the cowlings, they didn't have any engine anti-ice running. And also, I don't know if they knew about that they weren't properly de-iced by the ice crew. So What could have been done was the question.
Yes. To prevent the crash.
Was to be as, you know, to go with the caution side. You know, if you suspect that there's something out of the ordinary and something that's not looking right, you abort. All it takes is just abort. Cut the throttles and just stop. You know,
No
or
problem.
just decide not to go. That could have been just decision making.
Okay.
Proper decision.
And my final question for you would be, why do you think the co-pilot agreed with the pilot in command to take off, even though he knew that the wings were covered in snow?
Again, it kind of, in my opinion, I think it goes back to what I said about question one, that back in those days, in the 80s, in the early 80s, there was kind of like a hierarchy in the cockpit, you know, where the captain kind of had the final word. You know, the captain said, hey, you know, we're going, just like the Tenerife accident. You know, the captain said, hey, we're going. The first officer said, I don't think they cleared us for takeoff. The captain said, no, we're going to go anyway, and they ended up crashing into another 747. So same concept here. The captain might have just, you know, he just decided to just go because, and the FO didn't really have much word in it. It doesn't work nowadays like that.
All right. Thank you, sir.
You got it.
Appreciate your time.